Hello, and welcome back to Game Review. My name is Caleb Denby, and today it's going to be a historical game review going over a game between Bogoljubov and Alekhine way back in 1922. Apologies if I butchered either of those names. You're going to have to deal with it. This is a game which was a very, very interesting one. And there were some fun tactics and some fun positional play as well. So why don't we just jump in here and see what happened. D4, F5, the Dutch. So already I'm rooting against Alekhine here, but what can you do? Sometimes you make a mistake on move one. C4, knight F6, G3, E6, bishop G2. Alekhine gives this check. Not the most common line these days, but a fairly well-respected one. Bishop D2. And Alekhine goes ahead and gets rid of these bishops. And this is an idea you see in a lot of openings, actually, this bishop b4 check. The point is, sometimes it forces white to misplace his pieces. For example, this knight coming to d2 means this knight isn't coming to c3, even if it gets there with tempo. And c3 is generally a better square. On d2, it also kind of blocks in this queen. And so this is usually the idea, this bishop b4 check, which looks a little bit unnatural sometimes. That being said, black continues developing, knight c6, knight gf3, castles, castles, and now d6, queen b3, king h8, queen c3. And the point of this kind of unnatural maneuver with the queen, bringing it out to c3, is, well, for one, the knight was in the way, so we've solved that problem. And secondly, most of black's ideas revolve around pushing this pawn forward to e5, and expanding in the center, trying to make use of this f-pawn by controlling more of these central squares along the e file. However, despite all of white's best efforts, he did not manage to stop black from playing the move e5. Of course, you can capture this pawn, but if black recaptures, and you try to take it, you run into a very nasty problem on the d2 square. So e5 works out tactically, so white simply responds with e3, defending his center as well. Black continues with this move a5, hinting at the fact that he might want to place the knight onto this b4 square at a later date. Note that this knight actually works pretty well in tandem with this Dutch structure, because black may push to e4, and from e4, the knight and the pawn together control the d3 square, and that can sometimes become an annoying outpost. The move b3 is played for white. Now, it would be a mistake to play knight b4 here, because a3 would simply kick your knight away, in addition to the fact that you blundered your pawn. I forgive you, it's okay. Instead, we see queen e8, defending the pawn. a3 is played by white before this knight even thinks about landing on b4. And here, black plays queen h5, which is, a little ambitious. I think much better for black, for Alekhine here, is actually just to play the move e4. Just take your central space and don't look back. This knight is going to have to be a little bit misplaced no matter where you go. If you come to e1, then you had to go to e1. If you come to g5, you might get kicked by an h6 move. And if you're not careful, black's going to start rolling over your king side with all of this space. Instead, though, queen h5, Alekhine wanted to get the queen into play. And here, white plays an interesting move, h4. The point being, he wants to control this g5 square a little bit better. And this h4 move can be pretty helpful here, actually. Of course, in that last line we just looked at, h6 followed by g5 was a very relevant idea for black. And so this move is a little bit aimed at preventing that. That being said, black continues with this move knight g4, keeping a closer eye on this central pawn. White continues with knight g5, perhaps aiming for a similar idea with bringing this pawn to e6 that we looked at, like bringing this knight to d3. Both very, very annoying squares. Black simply plays this move, bishop d7, which is a little bit strange to my eyes. I think it's much better to just solve the problem with this knight immediately, bring this knight back to h3, where it's not going to do you any harm. But, okay, bishop d7, not the worst move ever. And now, white really needed to continue expanding on the queen's side. Black's advantage kind of lies on the king side, which you can see is where he's placed all of his pieces. And so white's play should really be focused more around the queen side. Moves like b4, moves like b5, really aiming to open up this bishop. Instead, though, white got a little bit sidetracked here. This knight was putting some uncomfortable pressure on a lot of these squares in the white camp. Moves like f4 could come on the board. So white played this move f3, forcing this knight away. And this is actually a big downside to this h4 move. You see, black has this option to play h6, whereas white no longer has the option to play h3. So he resorts to f3 to kick this knight away. And f3 is a very, very weakening move here. This knight simply retreats to f6. And now, the point of white's play was to continue with f4. And this idea is just a little bit misguided. By giving up so many central squares with this full dark square commitment, black's position is actually going to be quite nice here. The move e4 comes, and you'll hear a lot of people give the Dutch a little bit of a hard time, because you usually end up with, the Dutch bishop, where it's stuck behind all these pawns on light squares. But the fact is, this bishop isn't doing much better either. Just because it's an opponent's pawn on this light square doesn't mean this bishop has a better future than this bishop. And so this position, while white technically has the good bishop and black has the bad bishop, it's actually black's bishop that turns out to be more useful, supporting these squares on the queen side while the white bishop is locked away on g2. And so because of that, I really don't like the way that white chose to play this. With that in mind, though, white continues with the move rook f to d1. The move h6 comes, finally kicking this knight away. We see knight h3, and now black continues with d5, completing his expansion in the center. White tries a very strange rerouting of this knight to the f1 square, supporting the center a little bit. We see knight e7 from black, and now white plays this move a4. And so a4 is a pretty bad move, actually. You see black reroute this knight away from the b4 square, but just because it moved away doesn't mean it can't come back. And Alekhine does the funniest thing, and also the best thing, which is directly after playing knight e7, once he sees this move a4, he comes right back. This knight comes back to c6, and this b4 square is a permanent weakness now for white. Much better than a4, I think, is to really try to expand a little bit with this b4 idea. Keeping in mind all those ideas, you want to expand on the queen side with white, although his position is already a little bit shaky. Instead, though, we see a4, this knight comes back to c6, and after rook d2, black wastes no time coming to b4. And this idea that I talked about all those moves ago finally comes into play. This knight is aiming for the d3 square, and it's going to be a permanent problem for white. We see bishop h1 for white, which is a disgusting move. Never play bishop h1 in a position like this, where this diagonal is forever closed. I guess the idea is he wanted to bring some pieces over to this king side to try and open things up on this side of the board, but this was just not a good idea. It's just a bad idea, isn't it? We see queen e8, supporting some pressure on this queen side even more, preparing some ideas like maybe expanding. We see rook g2 from white, the point of bishop h1. Now, after d takes c4, if the queen were to capture this pawn, simply bishop e6, and this pawn is looking a little bit weak. And you can imagine things like knight d5, things like c5 are going to come. So instead, white just opts to play pawn takes c4, controlling these squares a little bit better. But of course, this gives up this pawn on a4. And now black is simply doing very, very well. This knight comes back to f2, really trying to force through this move g4 to try and loosen this diagonal just a bit, but it's far too slow. This bishop retreats to d7. This knight comes to d2 now. Like I said, really trying to hammer home the pressure on this pawn. But now black plays a nice move, b5. Like I said, expanding on the queen side now that he has this material advantage. This knight comes to d1. And finally, this knight lands on the annoying d3 square. I told you it would happen. If you didn't believe me, shame on you. Knights and pawns together work very, very well. You might be thinking, well, hang on a second. Did you just hang a pawn? And the answer is maybe. Black plays this move b4, and after rook takes a8, I'll let you calculate to the end of the line. I'm sure you all can do it at home. As you may have noticed, your queen is attacked. And so you might be tempted to recapture the rook, but not if you're Alekhine here. If you're Alekhine, you do something a little bit fancier. So I'll let you at home try and pause the video, try and find the full line to see the path to victory here. Okay, good luck. If you found it, I don't believe you. You might have found the first move, b takes c3, and after rook takes e8, maybe you didn't see anything better than recapturing this rook. But the problem, if you do that, of course, is that white will simply take this pawn. So you have to do better. How do you do better? Well, you go and make a new queen. That's pretty good. c2 is actually a fork. Not the most common fork you'll ever see in chess. This pawn is actually forking 2 promotion squares. It's impossible to stop both. You could play knight b3 to stop this one, or you could play, any knight move to stop this one, but you can't stop both at the same time. You can, however, take this rook for free, which he does, but after king h7, the same problem remains. In the game, white shows knight f2. White goes ahead and makes a second queen, and this knight comes back to f1. But now, this is a rather unfortunate configuration of all the white pieces here. It's very clear to see this bishop is not in the game. This rook is also pretty much completely out of the game. And after knight e1, if white plays a funny move, there's actually a very nice checkmate here to look out for. Of course, white didn't allow it, played rook h2, defending the f3 square. But now, after a move like queen c4, these pieces just aren't in the game, and it's clear to see that black is winning. Rook b8 was white's choice. Now bishop b5 makes another checkmating threat. If you play a move like knight d2, you're going to run into moves like queen c1, moves like queen e2, and it's just checkmate is near. So white sacrifices his only active piece to get rid of this bishop, and now g4, white's big idea, finally comes onto the board to little fanfare. Simply knight f3 check, bishop takes, pawn takes f5, we see queen e2, we see d5, and while this is a lot of pawns for white, keep in mind, none of his pieces are in the game. They're all serving a purely defensive role. So black simply plays king g8, really taking his time, even repeating the position. Well, not repeating the position, but going back and forth. After e4, knight takes e4, knight e4, queen e4. Simply a queen for a rook and a knight, but the rook and the knight are nowhere near active, and it's a fairly simple win for Alekhine here. d6, c takes d6, f6, all the pawns fall off the board. We finally see rook d2, and now after queen e2, black sacrifices his second queen for the match, sacrificing actually all 4 of his major pieces. Not something you see every day. And after e takes f1, his third queen has been sacrificed for a winning king and pawn endgame, which was quickly decided after a few more moves. King e6, king e4, d5 check, and here white resigns. So if you want to play like Alekhine, it's very, very difficult. He managed to sacrifice 5 major pieces this game, starting the game with only 3. Very impressive stuff. The takeaway I would take away from this game is to stick to your plans, stick to the natural plans. White should have been expanding on the queen side rather than, conglomerating all of his pieces around his king. And that's really where Alekhine broke through. Once white started committing to this awkward plan on the king's side, that's when Alekhine got his advantage. With that in mind, thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Game Review. My name is Caleb Denby, and I will see you in the next episode.